Hey scholars, Max von Neumann here to talk to you a little bit about arguments. Not a verbal fight argument, but an argument in the context of our logic series. Heidi, I'm not going to argue with you anymore. Just messing with you guys. Heidi and I rarely disagree. Now, an argument is a fundamental idea used in logic. The argument, along with other ideas, is used to construct a science of reasoning. Of course, constructing a science of reasoning is the purpose of logic. In an oversimplification, logic is the study of a specific instance of reasoning called arguments. Essentially, the argument consists of one part called the conclusion, in which you often have a binary choice. To oversimplify again, you can either accept the conclusion or reject it. Now, arguments can get complex, but the most simple argument has a conclusion of which one accepts or rejects, and the premise which may or may not support or convince you of the conclusion. To reiterate, don't think of an argument as a verbal fight, but think of it as an identifiable piece of reasoning in which a point is expressed and reasons are offered for that point. The point is the conclusion, and in the best of worlds, it stands out. The reason, sometimes convincing and sometimes not, are the premises and are meant to support the conclusion. Our job is to expose the argument. Exposing the argument means to pick out the conclusion and the premises. To expose an argument, focus on the conclusion first. Ask yourself what the presenter wants you to believe. Look for words such as therefore, it must be that, it is implied that. Words like these generally introduce the conclusion. Words that generally go with the premise are since, given that, because, and other words that are similar. Keep in mind, people are not always as clear as we'd like them to be. So definitely have them clarify their argument if possible. We want to be careful when filling in the blanks. So restating the argument and getting the confirmation from the source is a good starting point. If you cannot confirm the argument from the source that made it, restate the information as close to the original text as you can from the overall context. Don't be in a hurry. In your mind or on paper, break down the argument by numbering the statements. You can even put it into an orderly list or diagram it. Box or put a star by the conclusion before listing the premises. Look at the relationships in the premises. Sometimes a premise will independently support the conclusion, so maybe draw an arrow from the premise to the conclusion. In other cases, one premise infers the next, and yet in other cases the premises may be needed to be added together. This is called joint support to make the inference. But in all cases, ultimately, the premises in some format implies the conclusion. In the case where one premise infers the other, draw arrows from one related premise to the other till you finish with an arrow going to the conclusion. But keep those premises together since they are showing a line of thought. For joint support, where the statements cannot stand alone, essentially these are called dependent on one another, maybe put a plus sign between them. Feel free to develop your own style. Just make sure it's logical and that you're beginning to form a consistent method of your own. The point is, if it's your own method, it will make sense to you. Just know that the more arguments that you break down, the better you will get at it. So just get started. Outlining an argument can get pretty detailed, but it's recommended to focus hard on how the premises are related to the conclusion, and if the premises seem reasonable. Let's run through a couple short examples, and I'll show you how I'd break down some of the arguments that I see. Okay, here we are with example number 1. Now note that many arguments are much longer, maybe often a paragraph or so long. But what we're going to do is we're going to use this short example of an argument just to press our point. So here we have some statements. First statement is saying all birds have a vertebrae. Statement 2, falcons are birds. Statement 3, therefore, falcons have a vertebrae. Okay, so as we had mentioned before, the first thing we want to do is focus on the conclusion. Now, fortunately for us, in this case, we have a keyword therefore. So we identify it, and that indicates that this, more likely than not, is our conclusion. In this case, it is the conclusion. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose to put a star by it. Put anything you want there. Smiley face or anything. But that's indicating to me that that's the conclusion. Now, I'm just going to label the statements. So that I don't have to write the statements out, I'm just going to number them. I'm going to call this one number 1. So this is the first premise. The next premise I'm going to put as number 2. So now I'm going to have to sit here and think. I'll just look and I'll be like, okay, let me think about how the premises are related to the final conclusion. And so when I look at the conclusion, I see both falcons, which is here, and I also see the word vertebrae, which is up here, and I see that these birds are tied together, essentially. This is kind of tying those together. So I'm wondering, can these stand alone, or can they independently make the conclusion? And when I look at that, I say all birds have a vertebrae. Therefore, falcons have a vertebrae. The only way that I could have this stand alone independently would be as if I knew birds are falcons, which I do, but we can't make that assumption. So we certainly can't make that assumption in this case because they're making a second statement telling us. So now I'm kind of getting the idea that they're not going to be two statements both arrowing to the conclusion because they are not standing independently. So if they're not independent, they must be dependent on one another. And I'm going to use a plus sign. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, statement 1 is jointly related to statement 2. And together, I know all birds have a vertebrae and falcons are birds. So now that we know that this type of bird, that the falcon is a bird and birds have vertebrae, then we know together or jointly we can make the conclusion that falcons have vertebrae. So then I write my star down here. So that's one way to map it out. Of course, you're going to come up with your own style, but long as it's logical and you see that the arguments are flowing. Here's our second argument here. Now really our new argument is much like our first argument with some information added. But like our first argument, we're going to go for the conclusion first. Now here I see we can conclude that the falcons belong to the phylum Chordata. So therefore, I can put a star here. That's what I chose to use. And I'm going to note that as my conclusion. Then I'm going to go through and number my premises. So, the first statement, all animals that have a vertebrae belong to the phylum Chordata. That's going to be number 1. And then, like the other statements, birds are animals that have vertebrae. That's going to be statement 2. And since falcons are birds, that's going to be statement 3. Then quickly, I want to know if the statements are independent or dependent. So what I try to do is I read the statement and the conclusion by itself and see if it makes sense directly. If it doesn't, then they're probably going to be dependent on one another. Now, premise 1 is probably the strongest statement of the 3. But before we look to see if each one of the statements can independently support the conclusion, which we found over here by noting the word conclude, we want to focus on this one word here, falcons, because a lot of assumptions could be made there. So what we're going to note is that in this case, since we made statements about falcons, we are not going to state that we already know that falcons are birds, and we also don't know that birds automatically have a vertebrae. Now, speaking from that point, let's start with our first premise up here, and we're going to read the premise and see if it can directly go to the conclusion. All animals that have a vertebrae belong to the phylum Chordata. Therefore, we can conclude that falcons belong to the phylum Chordata. Okay, so falcons. Do we know that falcons have vertebrae? Since we have all this other information, we're going to assume that we don't know that falcons have vertebrae. So that's the only thing that's directly going to the final statement. So it's not mentioning falcons. It's not tying it into the vertebrae. So therefore, we make a judgment that premise 1 is not going to be able to stand alone. Premise 2 says that birds are animals that have vertebrae. All right, but again, like we discussed in the first argument that we did earlier, we don't know that falcons are necessarily birds. Again, we do, but because the information is given to us, we have to make the assumption that we don't know that.
Think as if you were an alien coming from another planet that didn't know the languages of Earth. As the alien, you do not know the physiology of birds or anything else. So you don't know birds have vertebrae. You are a galactic exploratory organism sent to Earth to use logic to understand language, connections, and earthling behavior.
So that's not enough information to directly go from statement 2 directly into the conclusion. Finally, we say, since falcons are birds, we can conclude that falcons belong to the phylum Chordata. All right, so now we know falcons are birds, but without statement 1 up here, we don't know that the birds have a vertebrae. We do know falcons are birds, but we need to know that falcons have a vertebrae or birds have a vertebrae, and there's nothing mentioned about the vertebrae in statement 3. So again, statements 1, 2, and 3 seem to be dependent on each other, which would be a joint type argument. And the way we would label this, one way of labeling this would be 1 plus 2 plus premise 3, arrows to the star. Now our next argument right here is a little simpler, but I did want to show a case where the individual premise could support the argument's conclusion by itself. So what we see here is a statement, or a bunch of statements, but again, as we pointed out before, we want to make sure we point out the conclusion first. That's a good tactic. So I comb through and I notice the word therefore. Therefore generally implies the conclusion. Therefore you are physically fit. That's where I'm going to put my star for the conclusion. Now, one way, in different ways, shapes, and forms, jointly, independently, dependently, everything has to run to confirm this conclusion, or at least attempt to confirm the conclusion. So the first statement is, you can run a mile in under 4 minutes. That's statement 1. Statement 2, you can wrestle competitively in Division 1. That's statement 2. You have a body fat measurement under 10%. Statement 3. And you can swim a mile and a half in 27 minutes. Statement 4. So we have 4 premises here. Now what we're interested to see is if they can independently support the final or the conclusion statement. So the way I like to do it is I like to read them as if they were independent. So I'm going to read the first statement, and then I'm going to run it into the therefore. You can run a mile in under 4 minutes. Therefore, you are physically fit. That seems to support it all by itself. If someone can run a mile under 4 minutes, again, you may claim that, well, we need more information than that. But from this statement, that seems pretty legitimate that if I can run under 4 minutes, and I have that foreknowledge, again, there's a lot of gray areas to whether I'm supposed to know this already, the assumption area, or not. Again, with the falcon being a bird, etc. So now we go to number 2. Number 2, you can wrestle competitively in Division 1. Now anyone that can wrestle competitively in Division 1 has got to be physically fit. So I will put a check mark next to that. That can independently, because if I read that, you can wrestle competitively in Division 1, therefore you are physically fit, it seems to make sense. That seems like if I were out in the world and I made that statement, someone would say, yeah, I tend to agree with that. Statement 3, you have a body fat measurement under 10%. Okay, maybe it's not as strong as a statement as all the rest of these, but still it could stand by itself. So I'm going to give that a check mark as independent, and I'm going to read it as an independent statement. You have a body fat measurement under 10%. Therefore, you are physically fit. Okay, so the idea that someone under 10% is probably physically fit is a pretty strong statement. It may not necessarily be 100% true, but we're going to look at it as an independent statement. Number 4, you can swim a mile and a half in 27 minutes. That's pretty darn fast. So if someone's lung capacity and they're able to keep up and they're able to feed their muscles with oxygen for 1.5 miles and do it in 27 minutes, you can swim 1.5 miles in 27 minutes. Therefore, you are physically fit. Again, I would claim that to be an independent statement. So the way I'm going to map out the independent statement differently than we did with the joints, because the joint statements, the joint arguments, we had to have plus signs in between each one of these. In this case, we can have a 1, statement 1. We can have a 2, a 3, and a statement 4. Again, with no plus signs in between them. And each one of those, here's our conclusion, the star. Each one of those are independently implying the conclusion. So in the independent case, you're coming up with a whole bunch of statements that are directly supporting the conclusion that you're trying to make. And when you're looking at someone's argument and you see that they're doing that, it's a good idea to map it out to see what arguments you might want to, potentially in the future poke holes in if you're trying to play devil's advocate. Okay, we have one last argument we're going to expose, break down, decompose, and then we're going to leave it to you to go find some arguments and break them down yourself. All right, looking at this argument up here, of course, as usual, we have a bunch of statements. Our goal is to find the conclusion. Now, I want you to note that most often we've been finding the conclusion as the last statement, but that's not always the case. Sometimes they put the conclusion first and then they put the premises after. Maybe like a structured essay. So they state what they're trying to convince you of, and then they put the reasonings. Okay, so as we look up here and we comb through, we notice the word conclude. So that's going to be our indicator that this is our conclusion. So we read that from furthermore, it seems reasonable to conclude that there could be a unified theory of radiant energy. So I'm going to put my star here again. Whether you use a star or a C for conclusion, that's up to you. So now we need to look and start building premise by premise. Let's find each one at a time. So reading the first sentence, it says, whenever a solid is heated, its color changes from red to orange, yellow, and then bluish white. Since is a premise word, so we know we're starting the next premise. So I'm going to make my bracket here. And I am going to put this as premise 1. This is my first statement, is going to be premise 1. From there, I say, since this change is the same for all solids, that's kind of a complete statement almost. It seems it could be explained. Now they're going on to make an explanation as to what happens after you find out that this change is the same for all solids. So I'm going to put this little portion here as our premise number 2. So then it goes on to say, it seems it could be explained without having to know much about the actual structure of any particular solid. So they're saying that it almost seems like they're saying these two statements up here are almost concluding this third statement here, but let's look into it a little deeper. So let's put our bracket here for 3. And we're going to end our bracket here for statement 3. And then it runs into the conclusion. Furthermore, it seems reasonable to conclude that there could be a unified theory of radiant energy. So now we're going to use the technique that we used in the past examples to see if each premise can stand alone, if it can stand independently. So let's read the first statement and run it right into the star statement, which is the conclusion. Whenever a solid is heated, its color changes from red to orange, yellow, and then bluish white. It seems reasonable to conclude that there could be a unified theory of radiant energy. All right, so to have a unified radiant energy theory, I don't know that that's enough of a statement there. It needs a little more support, I believe. So let's go to premise number 2, and we're going to read premise 2 as if it's independent and read it as a conclusion. Since this change is the same for all solids, it seems reasonable to conclude that there could be a unified theory of radiant energy. Okay, so we don't know what's going on with these solids. This word change here is being tied in together. So this is kind of my somewhat of an indication to me, at least, that these two are connecting statements. So I'm going to make this as a connecting statement. I'm going to look at this as 1 can't stand alone, but 1 plus 2, don't say equals 3. 1, statement 1 or premise 1 plus premise 2 is going to have more of a strong emphasis toward the conclusion. So now I know whenever a solid is heated, its color changes from red to orange. Now I notice a solid.
The word a is an indefinite article which indicates one. In our case, one solid, but does not identify the specific solid. If A were changed to any, our argument could plausibly stand strong without statement 2. Mapping the logic out without statement 2 would look something like this.
Any particular solid, but this here really seals the deal. All solids. So now I know it doesn't matter which solid that I pick. So those two together really make my argument a lot stronger, those two premises together. Now, what's that saying? It seems, 3 says it seems it could be explained without having to know much about the actual structure of any particular solid. So I think what the person's argument is trying to walk me down a road or walk me down this idea that if all solids go through this step-by-step statement or step-by-step process of changing colors in a particular order, and then we could probably explain this. We can explain, almost like another word for conclusion, right? Almost like another word for conclude. We can explain without having much knowledge about the structure of the particular solid. We don't need to know what type of solid it is. We don't need to know whether it's granite or some other type of, maybe wood or something else. We don't need to know that. We don't have to have that particular knowledge. All we have to know is that it's solid and that it runs through these particular movements. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make an arrow to 3, because with 1 and 2, at least what the person that's presenting the argument is trying to make, it seems clear that 1 and 2, if I accept those premises, then I could probably accept number 3 as that we don't, that it seems it could be explained without having to know much about the structure of the particular solid. All we have to know that it is solid, So now, from 3, if I know that it's solid and it's going to do all of these things, I know that possibly I could make a unified theory of radiant energy, which is the conclusion. And that's where the arrow goes to star. So that does it with this example. Now your job is to go out there, find arguments, and break them down. Maybe get out there, get yourself a logic book, and start reading chapter by chapter. Because, as we know, behind logic is a strong mind.
Hey, Alien Institute crew! Don't forget to strike the like, subscribe, comment, and share. Also continue learning by watching more AI videos.